Charis Kai Irene. Grace and peace to you. My name is Abiut Sagaya and I'm teaching Biblical Greek. I have students in one of the seminaries in Ethiopia. So I help them go through the lessons. So what I do a video lesson every time or every week so that I help the students to go through the material. So this lesson is brought to you not as a full load course, but as a highlight. So these video lessons are not the full load of the study, but they are very helpful. Although they are very short, but they are very helpful. So anyone who wants to start his beginning Greek class, I hope he will find it helpful. So this is what I do every week. So I appreciate if you can go through the lesson and give me your feedback, your comments, and also don't hesitate to subscribe to this channel. Let's grow this channel so that people learn the Greek of the Bible, so that they will have the feel of the original language. So the Lord willing, we may keep adding lessons as we go forward, and I hope you will enjoy it. May the Lord bless you. Thank you once again. Charis Kai Irene. Grace and peace to you. This is Greek 1, Lesson 2. In our previous lesson, in Greek 1, Lesson 1, we have studied about the basic elements of irregular verbs and other informations as well when we parse the Greek verbs. So I encourage you to go back and re-listen the lesson, because this lesson builds on the previous lesson. Today is Greek 1, Lesson 2, and it is part 2. In this part 2, we are going to talk about contract verbs. What are contract verbs? Before we define contract verbs, let's talk about these components of Greek verb: endings, stems or roots, and we also talk about the concept of conjugations. Here we have the regular verb luo, and it is present, indicative, active form. The verb tense is present, its mood is indicative, and its voice is active. Now this verb has two principal parts: the stem, which we call it roots, the stem or the root, which denotes the basic meaning of the word. For example, lu is the root for luo, meaning untie. So the root meaning is untie. But when we add an ending to it, which is the second part of any given Greek verb, the ending indicates the person, the personal ending. Who is doing the action? It tells me who is doing the action. Examples of the regular, present, indicative, active forms of the personal endings are o, eis, ei, omen, ete, and osin. So you see there are two parts of a Greek verb: the stem, the root word, and the endings, the personal endings that show who is doing the action attached to it, inflicted to it. And this process is called conjugation. That is, a pattern of the forms of a verb is called a conjugation. So the process that this verb goes through, that means the root plus the ending. This process is called conjugation. This is very important in our next slides, because we are going to talk about contract verbs, where when the stem ends with a vowel, and as you can see here, all the endings of the present tense indicative active forms has vowels. So when these vowels are attached or conjugated to the stem endings of some verbs, contraction occurs. Thus, we have contracting verbs. For now, focus on remembering these concepts. Okay, before we move on to our today's lesson, let me read for you from 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. Yoano Alpha Ho en ap arkes Ho akok kamen Ho urak kamen Tois of Talamois Humon Ho itas meta kai hai karis humon Efle fesan teri toulogo teis zoes. This is reading from 1 John chapter 1 verse 1. A little bit of recap here. These concepts, you have learned them in lesson 1, but let me repeat it again. I'm sorry, lesson 2 part 1. So here we do a repetition for us to remember them, because these are very important. Actually, this is for you to memorize them. Once you memorize them, it will be easier for you when you read any Greek sentence. You will have the ability to identify them, whether this is a present active indicative form. How do you know them? You know them by their endings. So it is vital for you to memorize these endings the way they are here. So we have persons, that is first person, second person, and third person. We have number, that is singular and plural. So the first person singular is O for I. And the first person plural is omen, we. And the second person singular is eis for you, singular, and ete in the plural, that is you, plural. And in the third person, we have ei, he, she, or it in the singular, and osin in the plural, they. So, like I said earlier, it is very vital for you to memorize this. Very helpful. Memorize this paradigm. It will save your life when you read Greek New Testament. Now let's talk about two categories of Greek verbs. Now there are the verbs whose stems end in epsilon, alpha, or omicron, which are basically called O verbs because they have this ending. This is the basic or the vocabulary form of each verb. So there are some verbs where their stem ends with an epsilon, with an alpha, and with an omicron. Why do we have this omega? Is because the vocabulary form that would be given to you every time in your vocabulary memorization part is actually the present indicative active form. So let's call this O verbs. Example, luo, agapeo, and you can name it, gnosko, okay, where their endings are epsilon, alpha, omicron. Now we have verbs. Second type of verbs are verbs whose stems end in me, and they are referred to as me verbs. So me verbs, we'll talk about them later in this course. But for now, just remember that there are two types of Greek verbs. One, those stems end in E, epsilon, alpha, omicron, which we call them O verbs. An example is luo, and there are verbs whose stems end in me, and we refer to them as me verbs. An example is didomi. Have this in mind. Don't worry about memorizing them. But our next lesson focuses more on these verbs, the verbs whose stems end in epsilon, alpha, and omicron, which we call them O verbs. And our focus is specifically about the contraction that happens when these stems are attached to or inflected to the endings, where there is change occur. We call that contraction. Let's go to the next slide. Contract verbs. What are contract verbs? When the verb's stem ends in epsilon or alpha or omicron, contraction takes place in the formation of certain verbs. Okay, some verbs will go through contraction. That's why we needed to study these verbs. Okay, this lesson is important because you are going to encounter them in your Greek reading, and sometimes you may be confused because these are not regular verbs. These are irregular verbs. They become irregular. Their form becomes irregular. They will not be like luo. They will have a different form, slightly different, where you might be confused. So it is now a good time to study about them. These verbs are called contract verbs. The contraction of the vowels produces either a diphthong, like poiomen, ou is a diphthong, or a lengthening, that is ginomen. Ginomen is here. This is supposed to be omicron, the short vowel, but because of the contraction that was taken place, it has become a long vowel. It has been lengthened. Now let's talk about what is lengthening. In the next slide, I'll explain more, but here is a brief idea about lengthening. In ancient Greek, the lengthening of vowels such as alpha and eta occurs during verb contraction. This typically happens when two vowels merge into a single long vowel or diphthong. Here is an example. Okay, here this is supposed to be just omen, the O, omicron short vowel, but a diphthong happened because of the contraction. And here, as I said before, this is supposed to be O short vowel, but because of contraction, now it is a lengthened long vowel. So I will explain more in the next slide. But for now, just remember what contract verbs mean. Lengthening of Greek vowels. Now more on lengthening. When alpha is involved in contraction, it often lengthens to eta. If the alpha has an iota combination, the iota will be subscripted. Here is an example of lengthening. When alpha is attached to iota in the contraction, it will be the result is the eta, the lengthening. And then omicron plus alpha, the result is a lengthened omega. Now about the iota subscript. When we have a combination of alpha and iota, we will have iota subscript, and it is written like this. When we have eta with an iota combination, then we will have iota subscript. It is subscripted, not fully scripted, but subscripted, written underneath the vowel. And then omega with iota subscript looks like this. Now, when eta is involved in contraction, it generally remains eta. So you see, lengthening mostly happens when epsilon is attached to alpha, when omicron attached to alpha. So remember this. This is very important as you go through the next lessons. Contract verbs ending with epsilon. So this is the first contract verb form that we are going to see. We've said there are three. Their stems ending with epsilon and alpha and omicron. But now let's begin with those ending with the stem, whose stems end with epsilon. Now, when a verb has, it is a stem, epsilon, the vowel epsilon. So remember this, okay? A given Greek verb will have two parts. One is the stem and the second is the ending, okay? The personal ending. So now the stem will tell you the basic meaning of the word. But here is the issue. There are some verbs whose stem end with a vowel. And like I've said earlier, the personal endings has vowels and diphthongs. So when these diphthongs or vowels are attached to a vowel ending verbs, okay, verbs that has their stems ending with a vowel, say epsilon and alpha and omicron, there will be a contraction, okay? Now, let's see how it works. I'll give you an example and an exercise in the coming, in the next slides, very shortly. But for a minute, let's talk about this one. So when you have the stem of the verb ending with epsilon, and then you have another epsilon in your ending, okay, in your ending, the ending of the verb, the result is this diphthong. And if you have epsilon, then you have an omicron, then you will have this diphthong. And epsilon plus long vowel, you know, eta or omega, or any diphthong. Diphthong, you know them, right? This is a diphthong, this is a diphthong. Then the E, the epsilon disappears. So there will be no epsilon. Okay, epsilon will disappear. Now, I know this will be overwhelming for you right now, but when we do exercise, when I give you an example, it will become clearer. But for now, just have in mind this formula or write it somewhere and keep it for yourself. Okay, when you do the exercises and when you follow this lesson, you will use it. But for now, this is the rule. Now, contract verbs ending with alpha, okay, whose stem end with an alpha, the vowel alpha. So a summary of the contraction patterns for this group of verbs is, now alpha plus any O sound, that is, could be omicron, could be omega, could be OU, the diphthong, then the result is a lengthened omega. Then alpha plus epsilon. You remember we said when alpha is attached to epsilon or omicron, an eta is produced. But here we have an alpha, but I will show you what it means in the next video. In the next slide. That alpha plus any combination containing an iota will have alpha together, iota, but you don't write it like this. It should be written like this with the iota subscript, the one I showed you just in the previous slides. Good. This is another pattern. Let's go to the next one. Contract verbs ending with omicron. So this is the summary of the pattern of these groups of verbs. Omicron plus long vowel. What is a long vowel? Eta is a long vowel. Omega is a long vowel. So what happens? Omega. The result is an omega. Omega plus short vowel could be epsilon, iota, alpha, upsilon, or any diphthong like OU, and you'll have an OU. And alpha or omicron plus a combination containing an iota, that is OU. Okay, the result is OU. Again, have in mind that these are the patterns for those three categories of the endings. Okay, in the next lesson, I am going to give you a good example of the verbs and how their contraction pattern work in practice. But for now, just stick to what I have said, and please review this video for an effective learning. See you in the next part of the lesson. For now, bye-bye.